Hello and welcome to the Tennessee Informer. I'm your host, Dave Vance. Thank you for tuning in tonight for this special edition of the Tennessee Informer. Our very special guest tonight is Dr. Bill Warner, founder of the Center of the Study for Political Islam International. Bill Warner is a Ph.D. He's a highly respected expert on political Islam. In 2006, he founded the Center for the Study of Political Islam to further the study of the politics of the ideology of Islam and its ramifications for Western civilization. Warner defines political Islam as the part of Islamic doctrine which concerns the non-Muslim. Warner is the author of 15 books, including the Amazon bestseller Sharia Law for Non-Muslims, which is published in 20 languages. His simple Quran is the first Quran that can be easily understood by integrating Muhammad's life into the Quran verses. This method gives a context to the book which makes the meaning transparent. All his books are concise and easy to understand. Warner has published numerous articles on the topic of political Islam and is a prolific video blogger with over 150 videos dedicated to commentary and education on this subject. His video, Why We Are Afraid, has over 4 million views. Warner has led seminars and given public talks throughout the United States and Canada and internationally in Central Europe and the Balkan countries. In 2014, he established, together with his partner Milan Podritri, the Center for the Study for Political Islam International, a volunteer nonprofit organization based in Brno, Czech Republic, with affiliates around the globe. CSPI translates and publishes Warner's books worldwide, provides trainings and lectures, and does research on political Islam. Warner created the first self-study course on political Islam. His books give an overview of the complete Islamic doctrine and addresses how the doctrine is applied to world events. CSPI books are also available as a web-based community learning platform. Bill Warner holds a Ph.D. in physics and applied mathematics from North Carolina State University. He's been a research scientist at the Sarnoff Princeton Labs, a business owner of an energy efficiency company, and a university professor. The website is cspii.org. Bill, good to see you and thanks for coming on. How are you?
Doing fine. Gosh, when I listen to my intro, I think I sound good.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, before we get to the main topic, is there anything else you want to say about CSPI?
Yes. When I started this whole business, which started on September 11th, 2001, I realized that I lived in a nation and didn't know a Hindu from a Buddhist from a Muslim. And so I'm a scientist. And I like fact-based reasoning, and I realized that we needed to bring out the facts of Islam. So I spent, since the rest of my life dealing with this subject because I happen to think that the most important subject of the 21st century is what is the true nature of Islam. So I created the concept, knowing that I'm an old man, I'm 82, that I was going to die, and I also knew that as an individual, I can't beat an army. And Islam, if you will, is an army. So I decided that I needed to create a center that would allow my work to go forward after I'm dead and also to be an international force. Well, it turns out I got this call from Milan Podritri, who I didn't know from Adam's off Ox, that could he start a Center for the Study of Political Islam in Europe? And I was like, sure, why not? Well, it turned out through the good event, it just turned out to be fate. Milan is a genius at organization and administration. I'm a doofus. I can't organize a 3-car funeral. I detest management stuff. So he handles all the operational. I don't do any of that because I'm a disaster at it, mainly because I don't like it. So I feel like my life has been fulfilled now because my work can go forward. As I said, I think the work of understanding political Islam is the most important thing of the 21st century. So here I am after all this time, doing all these things, talking to you, Dave.
Well, and I just want to say, I mean, I've known you for several years now, and most of what I've learned about Islam, I learned from you, from your books and from your seminars, talking to you and watching your videos. And I know that especially in the state of Tennessee, most of the people in the state of Tennessee, if they know anything about Islam, they learned it from you or your books. I mean, that's just, you really were making the rounds early on. And I'm just thankful that we had somebody in our state And somebody that's easy to, connect with and is willing to go. I mean, you don't do as much, as many individual events as you used to, but I'm just thankful that our state had you, because, like I say, if people in Tennessee know about Islam, they probably learned it from you.
I was driving home one night about 10 o'clock, and I said, I'm like a Methodist circuit rider. I would have as many as 3 talks in a week all across Tennessee. So it's been a lot of hard work. But let me say this, I've also enjoyed it.
Yeah.
As a scientist, you would like to think that you could leave some impact. Now, most of your work, if you're a physicist, is going to be done before the age of 35. Well, in my 60s, I realized I was a little behind the ball. So I was very intrigued when I started my work on Islam, because my whole idea was to do the fundamentals, the DNA. And so I wanted a scientific approach. It turns out I'm the first scientist who ever studied Islamic text on a factual basis. Previous commenters on Islam and experts were like from Arabic history, Arab scholars, other things, but none of them were scientists. And I had a very different approach to this, because I was asking questions like, what are the fundamental principles?
Right.
So as a scientist, I was tickled to death that I had finally, in the latter years of my life, run into the thing which I wanted to do, which was original work. And it's been very pleasing to me, actually. I hate to say this, but I have really enjoyed the work, because the more I worked with it, it was like, whoa, there's principles here. And there was a lot to be known.
And you connected a lot of dots.
Yes, I did.
Yep.
You can read my books and you can answer any question about Islam. Even if some people are afraid of some Islamic scholar at some university, but if you read my books, you know more about Islam actually than he does, because they don't emphasize the fundamentals. They don't emphasize the basics.
Well, tonight we're going to talk about sex and Hamas. Most are probably familiar with reports of rape and murder committed by Hamas against the Israelis on October 7th. Should anybody that knows the doctrine of Islam or knows anything about Hamas be surprised?
Absolutely not. As a matter of fact, my wife said, Bill, do you realize you did a video some years ago about Hamas and Israel? And let me just give you the information. If you want to see that video, which was done years ago, go to my channel on YouTube, Political Islam, and it's the Hamas jihad against Israel. And I was amazed. Nothing has changed in those years since then. But really, where I'm from, it hasn't changed in 1,400 years, because for me, it isn't that this war with Hamas and Israel started on October 7th. It started 1,400 years ago. So I have a whole different view of all of this.
You take the long view, and you have plenty of evidence to back that up.
I'm getting ready to give you some. Let's look at the history of Islam. First off, Islam was basically built by Muhammad, and he had 2 phases to his life. This is critical in understanding anything about Islam. There are 2 different Muhammads. There are 2 different Islams. There are 2 different Qurans, because Muhammad's career worked like this. He taught about Islam in the town of Mecca for 13 years and converted about 150 people. It was religion. And the Quran in this period has poetry and has some actual beautiful language. But when he got to Medina, he'd always told the folks in Mecca, I am of the lineage of the Jewish prophets, because they needed a category to put him in. Well, when it got to Medina, there were 3 tribes of Jews there, and they said, you're not one of our prophets. You're not even in the lineage. So this, to say the least, irritated Muhammad. Let's summarize his irritation by pointing out that 2 years later, all the Jews were gone from Medina. Killed, exiled, whatever. So this is Muhammad. Now, he only converted 150 people in Mecca, but in Medina, when he died, all the Arabs of the Arabian Peninsula were Muslims.
Wow.
Well, this is very impressive. the religion didn't work, but the politics was overwhelming. The politics has influenced the world ever since because Muhammad insisted that his work not be just to believers, but that all the world had to follow his work and his way. Well, this gets a little tough on us because his way is being seen in Hamas and Israel today. I'll talk a little bit about the Jews. I mentioned that he killed all the Jewish tribes in Medina, but far more than that. The Quran, which peculiarly enough, even though the Quran says it's the eternal words of the only creator God of the universe, a great deal of it is involved with the politics of what Muhammad wanted. Example, there was a new woman in his life, and he wanted to marry her. Well, it turns out that although he already had 4 wives, the Quran says it's okay for him to get another one. Aisha, his favorite wife, said, "Your Lord is quick to give you your wishes." Well, these wishes were something that was happened at the time. So Muhammad was always active, and the Quran reflected his activities. So let's take, like I say, his history was that the religion didn't work, but the politics, jihad. He developed the concept of jihad, and let me say here, just as a little definition, jihad is not just killing people. That it has that reputation, but the worst parts about jihad are not the deaths it causes, but the way it infiltrates a society. We're seeing jihad, which can be done with a sword, speech, money. That the way Islam is entering the United States today has nothing to do with killing. As a matter of fact, the worst thing that ever happened for the Muslim Brotherhood was September 11th, 2001, because it let everybody know they were here. As a matter of fact, when I saw the second plane hit the second tower, I was watching it on television. I said, "It is jihad. Islam is here." Well, the Muslim Brotherhood had done very well, thank you, by being invisible.
And I want to say something about that, the Muslim Brotherhood. Pretty much all of the Islamic organizations, the terrorist organizations, whether you're talking about Hamas or you pick a name, they all come from the Muslim. They can all trace their roots back to the Muslim Brotherhood, correct?
Absolutely correct. The Muslim Brotherhood is far more dangerous to us than a so-called terrorist. Let me say a word about the word terrorist. One of the ways we failed in our study of Islam is to use words that are from political science. All the words that I use for Islam come from its doctrine, which seems to me to be fair. These are jihadists. They're not terrorists. I'll spin more about this later, but as a scientist, you need to pay attention to words because precise meanings lead to clear thinking. And vague meanings of terms leads to fuzzy thinking. And goodness gracious, in the world of Islam and modern media, we have enough fuzzy thinking going on.
Absolutely.
So, now where was I? You talk about the history.
Right.
If you read, most people are not aware of this, but if you study the history of Christianity in Turkey, most people don't know that Turkey used to be a Christian nation. As a matter of fact, several of the 7 churches in Asia were in Turkey, what's now called Turkey.
And they became Islamic by force.
Yes, yes. Actually, not only by force, but there's 2 kinds of force. Killing is the maximum force, but there's another kind of force. The conquered people became dhimmis, D-H-I-M-M-I-S. Yep. And dhimmis were like semi-slaves. For instance, there was a whole formal law about dhimmis. They couldn't carry a sword. They couldn't ride a horse. They could only ride a donkey. If they were approaching a Muslim in the street, they had to step into the curb to let the Muslim pass. If they went into a room and there was a Muslim entered the room where a bunch of Christians were sitting, you had to stand up and give them your seat. These were just some of the issues. You couldn't sue a Muslim in court. So, and if your daughter was raped, you couldn't even appeal to the law. So what happened is, after time, it would be that they would just become Muslims so they could earn more money and not be persecuted. Now, there was a good film made about Christianity in Turkey. And this man, who was sort of the protagonist, the he in order to become a Christian, in order to get treated well, he had to convert to Islam. So he did it basically under force. He talked to a Muslim friend of his. He said, "You know, I don't really believe in Islam." And the man says, "That doesn't make any difference whatsoever at all, because your children will believe more than you do, and your grandchildren will not even remember who you are. They'll become Muslims." So this illustrates several things. One was Islam is a gradual process. You may not realize it's going on. And the other is that it is ceaseless. It thinks in terms of centuries. I like to say that Westerners measure time with a watch, Muslims measure time with a calendar. This has egregious effects because years later, Turkey is now 97% Muslim, and in another generation, it will be 100% Muslim.
Right. Well, if you look at America, just since 9/11, you would think that maybe we would have fewer Muslims, fewer mosques. They might have less influence, but no, it's exact opposite after 9/11.
Yes. Osama bin Laden had something to say about this. He said, people love a strong horse. And so Islam appears powerful, and there are people who are attracted to that power. There's a story in the Sirah, the life of Muhammad. A man killed his business partner who was a Jew. And his brother said, "Why would you kill him? He put the fat on your belly. He was an excellent business partner." And the man said, "Muhammad told me to." And the man looked at his brother and says, "If Muhammad told you to kill me, would you do that?" He said, "Yes, I would." The response of his brother was, "This is a fine religion. I want to join it too. I like its firmness." I'm making a point here, which is that people look like a winner. Well, anybody who follows sports can tell you that is true. And Islam is a winner. But anyway, back to 1928 in Turkey. There was basically a revolt by the Christians in Turkey, and the Muslims attacked them vociferously. The sexual violence that we hear in Gaza today and Israel today is found exactly the same. I'll never forget reading a story about how this girl was tied up in the garden, had her breast cut off, and a sword rammed up her vagina. This is the kind of thing we're seeing in Hamas today. The point I'm making here is that Islam never changes. I'm always amused and saddened when I hear people, "Well, all we need to do with Islam is reform it." First off, they don't know what the meaning of reform is. It means to make again, according to the original plan. And Islam, in its very beginning, was basically the same as Hamas and Osama bin Laden. But the Muslim Brotherhood doesn't use the sword except as a last resort. They've determined that the best way to take over a country is not to attack it, but instead to become like we have here in Nashville. We have council members who are Muslims. There are Muslims in the Congress. The day will come when we'll have a Muslim governor and a Muslim senator. It's the Muslim Brotherhood's plan that we'll have a Muslim president.
Yeah. Well, in Nashville, we have AMAC, American Muslim Advisory Council. They've been around for years, and they've associated with some of the worst of the worst, but they're still there.
They point out something to you. Our current governor, Bill Lee, who is a pleasant man and would make a nice neighbor, doesn't have a strong backbone, in my personal opinion.
No, he doesn't.
We agree on that?
Oh, yeah, we agree on that. Absolutely.
So AMAC can get a visit with him anytime they want.
Oh, yeah. One of the first people he met with, he wasn't even in office yet when he met with them, right after he was elected.
This is true. As a matter of fact, I think that you and I were at a same meeting in which he came to give us pleasant words, and he presents himself very well. Like I say, he'd make a great neighbor. But he didn't try to, he said, basically, I can learn all about Islam. I want to through this other person who is there. He'll tell me what I need to know. Well, the person he was pointing to teach him Islam didn't know squat. I mean, he knew squat, but not much more than that.
Right.
The point I'm making here is that the Muslims can go see him, but I couldn't. So that's the Muslim Brotherhood. And I say they're far more dangerous to us because when you they don't Muslim Brotherhood doesn't wear beards. They wear nice clothes. They speak well. They present themselves very well. So this needs to be known about Muhammad. Some people think of him as being whatever, but he was a very charming man. Very
Most
charming.
psychopaths are.
Well, it turns out my wife had a cousin who was a dancer in Europe in the 30s, and she did a command performance and for Hitler. Her comment was he was a very charming man. So the charm doesn't go all the way.
Right.
But back to the Muslim Brotherhood, they do charm very well. They're not scary people. When you're talking to a member of the Muslim Brotherhood, you would never think that he represents the thin, cutting edge of Sharia. Let me define Sharia here. Sharia is basically Islamic law, but that is too small a definition. Law used to us means courts, law, legal things, but Sharia covers everything. It covers how to say hello. There's no aspect of your life that Sharia doesn't cover. What food to eat, what your obligations are, how to be a father, how to be a mother, how to have sex. So Sharia is basically everything about a civilization. Now, let me point out something here. There's a term that I use called civilizational war.
Yep.
Muhammad, I maintain, was the world's greatest military genius. Nobody dies for Napoleon or Caesar today, but someone died today because of Muhammad. Muhammad viewed war not as just sword, but use of propaganda, poetry. He had basically a PR firm. That's maybe a little overstated, but he had people who worked for him who were poets. Now, poetry at this time in Arabia was very important. As a matter of fact, later we'll find out that you could get killed for writing the wrong poetry. But he had a man who worked for him and would denigrate his enemies. So Muhammad saw civilizational war as covering everything about a civilization. For instance, here in America today, we're being Islamicized by the use of food, halal food. There's a press in some countries and some states of the United States to serve only halal food at the prisons.
Yep. It's in the schools too, and some of the schools have bought on to that.
Yes. Well, this is civilizational war. We don't see it as war, but Muslims do. So I compliment Muhammad in that he was the greatest believer in war, real war, which covered all aspects of life. For instance, we spent 20 years in Afghanistan. We had 18 generals. Stanley McChrystal, who was supposed to be a great battlefield general, wrote a paper on the strategy to win the war in Afghanistan. Well, I looked at this. It was redacted, of course. I looked at his strategy. What was interesting was, and I say wisdom knows what is missing. And what was missing was the word Islam, jihad, these kind of words that dealt with. So we did not even know who the enemy is.
Oh, we know who it is. We're just too cowardly, in my opinion, to say who it is and what it is. I mean, you think about it, when we fought, when we were opposed to the Soviets, we taught our people and taught our military what was wrong, what Soviet doctrine was, and how it was bad. Same thing during World War II with the Germans and the Japanese. We taught, but we don't do that with Islam. It's
No,
like
we
won't even, you think about it, even after, I think 2006, when you had that Dr. Hassan, Major Hassan in Fort Hood kill all this, the first concern from our senior leadership in the military was, well, we hope this doesn't hurt our Arab language recruitment. We hope that the reaction to it doesn't hurt our recruitment. It's insane.
Makes me want to bang my head against the wall.
Yeah.
The thing that really disgusts me is that if you told them I can tell you the truth, they'd run you out of the office.
Yeah.
We have made ignorance a virtue.
Well, there's a few people that we both know that, they were in federal law enforcement, and I think partly because of that view, they wanted to tell the truth, and they had to go tell the truth on their own time because the FBI and others didn't want to hear it.
I remember a friend of mine who's former FBI, retired now, said that he was talking with some young agents, and he said, "Would you like to know about political Islam?" And they were like, "No." Scary, because if we mentioned Islam, we could lose our job. Well, a book that everybody likes to quote is Sun Tzu in The Art of War. He said the first step is to know your enemy.
Yep.
We don't want to know the enemy.
Yep. We're not allowed to know ours.
No. And he said the best position you could be in a relationship with your enemy is they don't know you exist. Well, we don't really are willing to admit that Islam. It was Bush, who was a Republican, who stood on the steps of the National Cathedral and said, "Islam is the religion of peace."
Yep. And who was standing with him at that time? And this is how bad it is.
Brotherhood.
Muslim Brotherhood was all around him. People from Muslim Brotherhood, which is CARE also. CARE is another front, Council on American Islamic Relations. That's just another Muslim Brotherhood front group. And they were all around him when he went on national TV and said, Islam is a religion of peace. It's been hijacked by a bunch of terrorists. And then we had a war on terror instead of a war on the jihadist.
Terror, may I point out, is a technique. And it's important to know here that when we use the word terror as a substitute for jihad, we're losing meaning, because anybody can be a terrorist. I hope you're not, but anybody can take up a gun and go down to the mall and start killing people. That's terrorism.
Right.
But jihad is very different. Jihad has a 1,400-year history. Jihad has rules. So we need to understand that we need to use the right words. And terrorism is not the word. Jihad is.
Now, you mentioned what was going on with Hamas and their use of sex as a terror tactic, and of course that also happened in Turkey. But it goes well beyond that. I mean, that's always been part of Islam, is using sex in that regard.
Yes, as a matter of fact, Muhammad was very involved in sex. I think he had 11 wives, which sounds to me. What you do with 11 wives, I'm not sure. But I do know this. His harem, which should have been the most perfectly harmonious group in the world, divided into two camps. And they continually bitched about each other. So here we have the perfect human being, the model for all the universe, and he has a harem of 11 women, and he can't even keep peace in his own house. But he was very involved in sex. He had sex slaves. He gave them his presents. As a matter of fact, I mentioned earlier, he had a poet who did PR work for him. He gave him a white sex slave. Let me make a remark about white sex slaves. The slave markets in Mecca weren't shut down until about the early 1960s.
Right.
The highest priced woman historically in the Meccan slave markets was a white woman. I leave that to your imagination. As a matter of fact, I was reading a man from North Africa. He was discussing the different races of women and their desirability for sex. I forget which one it was he preferred. I think Ethiopian. But the point I'm making here is that sex was very much a part of Islam after battle. For instance, there were 800 Jews in the city of Medina, and they were all killed in one day. The women were kept to be sold into slavery, and particularly for sex slaves. There's a famous hadith, which is basically what Muhammad said and did, little snapshots. And it was after a battle, and the men were having sex with the women. They were concerned about the fact that they were married. So this was kind of like cheating on your wife. Well, the Quran, lo and behold, says that when you capture the woman, her marriage is annulled. So then have sex with them all you want. He also discovered that men were having sex, coitus interruptus, in order not to impregnate the women. Why? Because they brought more money without a baby. This was all laid out in the doctrine of Islam. As a matter of fact, we need to mention here that Islam has a war doctrine. You would think if Islam has a formal war doctrine that we'd want to know what it is. But no. There was a man I know who was in the Pentagon on September 11th, and he had studied Islam. And he started talking around the Pentagon about the true nature of Islam. Well, George Bush, a Republican conservative, fired his butt. He was a major. The Muslims said he was a bigot and a racist and a hater. He was just telling what was in the volume, in the books, just like I do.
Right. I can tell you that, and I'm no longer in the military, but I can tell you that there was not the amount of information about Islam and the doctrine of Islam that there should have been even before the invasion of Iraq. It's not something that they taught us a whole lot about. They just taught us certain things not to do to offend them. But then it got worse after Bush left. It got even worse once Obama got in there. Then they came back and started doing the whitewash with the different briefings we would get, because they didn't want to do anything that pointed the finger at Islam, that identified it as a doctrinal trait of Islam. They wanted to avoid that at all cost.
And they've avoided it.
Yeah.
As a matter of fact, if you look, in the FBI, there's less knowledge than ever before, and I suspect in the military it's the same thing. Let's go back to the history of jihad. Most people are not aware of this, and it's a tragedy they don't. But Armenia has been under attack from Islam for 1,200 years. It's happening again. Yeah. Do you know that looking at the media? Nope, don't mention it. But I mention it because it's true and it's been happening. Some of the same sexual marauding is happening in Armenia that has happened in other places. Look at my notes here to see what else.
Well, now let's talk about that just for a second, because I know that's happening again, but wasn't there I think it was the Turks that went on the rampage against the Armenians in the early 20th century?
Yes.
And that's always like a sore topic that's not to be brought up.
I'll give you an example.
Yeah.
In my infinite ways of making mischief, I decided, having been down I learned this from Bobby Petray. One of the most valuable things she did for me was to let me lobby alongside of her in the legislature. What an education. I learned a lot about the reality of how laws are made. In other words, how the sausage is made.
Right.
And where was I going with that? Oh, I decided to get a fairly meaningless piece of paper, but still it's there. What do they call it a resolution?
Resolution, yeah.
A resolution. And so I wrote one about Islam in Tennessee. Well, I mentioned the fact of the Armenians. The Muslim Brotherhood went berserk. So what did our legislators do? Well, they withdrew that part of the resolution.
Yeah.
Because they did not want to offend the Turks. Now, we mentioned the Muslim Brotherhood earlier. Let me point out to you that the Muslim Brotherhood was in a phase of its time bringing legislators to Turkey so they could see the real Islam. Our legislators went and liked it. The clergy also got invited to Turkey to see the real Islam, and they loved it. They said, if this is Islam, let us have more of it. Makes me want to cry.
Yeah. Well, and you look at the universities, even in Tennessee, and Christian universities that have kowtowed to the Muslims and have done things to cater to them and actually, made stands against their own students because the student wanted to say something negative about Islam. I mean, you've had that at Belmont, you've had it in other places. It's insane that even the churches are cowards when it comes to this, a lot of them.
Yes, they are. As a matter of fact, I went to a seminar at Lipscomb University, which is supposedly a very good school, and it's a religious institution, where they told us how good Sharia finance was, and that we should back Sharia finance. This was at a Christian university.
I'm glad you brought that up, and I know you remember this. So Sharia finance, which is essentially jihad with money, right?
Yes.
Well, in about 2012, when Bill Haslam was still in office, And Bill Haggerty, current Senator Bill Haggerty, he was the head of the Economic Development Department. And I remember when he hired Samar Ali to be the head of the foreign division of our state economic development. Now, it's not per se, I'm not saying that he hired her per se for her expertise in Sharia compliant finance, but she was definitely an expert in that. And then if you look at the connections that she has, her father was involved with the Jerusalem Fund, which is a big BDS organization. And just even if we got to dig in later and we found out that her husband was working at had ties to banks in Qatar, to include the bank where, and I cannot remember the guy's name and I couldn't pronounce it if I had to, the guy who coined the phrase jihad with money in reference to Sharia compliant finance. But here we have people like Bill Haggerty and others, Bill Haslam, thinking that that's somebody we should put in charge of our finances. Now that was years ago, but I haven't forgotten about that.
Let me put in a positive word here because we've been talking about a lot of stuff that's pretty negative. Since 9/11, something has happened that was very positive. People know a lot more now about Islam than they did before 9/11. Yeah. So we had to have some success. It's important that we keep up not only with our losses, but with our success. And today, people know a lot more about Islam than they ever did.
True.
The Muslim Brotherhood was right. This was a disaster from the PR front. We should have never had 9/11 because it caused too many people to go, what the hell is going on?
Yep.
I think that everyone who will watch this video can tell us where they were on 9/11 in the morning. Yep. I sure can. Clear as a bell.
Oh, yeah.
Because it changed my life. So we have made some progress. That is to be known. But I notice when I speak to the young, like the high school students, they've been disgustingly indoctrinated. As a matter of fact, my objection to schools is they no longer teach critical thinking. They just indoctrinate. Yep. I think we've seen that at Harvard. It's just an indoctrination system. By the way, that gave me great joy to see that happen in the Ivy League because I've known for some, let me give you an example. I gave a talk at Vanderbilt University. I was invited there by some conservative club. I gave what I thought was an appropriate thing for a university. I said, the statistical basis of Islamic doctrine seems totally authentic. I'm not throwing bombs or lighting fires. And that was over. The advisors of that club pulled the leader over who wanted to go to law school. He says, if you ever bring any man like that to this campus again, you will never go to any law school. So much for critical thought.
Right.
This is a university. They're supposed to enjoy critical thought. When I went to school, which was back in the last century, I went to university in order to hear new ideas, to see new things. Now then, they'll almost give you a written guarantee that you will never hear anything that offends you because we have safe spaces. What the hell is a safe space? But when it comes to thought, but we're willing to censor ourselves in order not to deal with the reality.
That doesn't change reality, though. It only makes it worse for us.
What do you think about that? Let me go back to my thing about history. I created a term called the tears of jihad. When I was doing all my work, one of the things I was amazed to find was I was the first person who had done any of this kind of work at all in the history of scholarship. And one of those was, this seems like a reasonable question, how many people died under Hitler? How many people died under Stalin? How many died under Mao Zedong, who holds the record, by the way? Those are reasonable questions. But nobody had ever asked this question before. How many people have died under jihad? Reasonable question. Here are the answers. 60,000 Christians, 80,000, I'm sorry, 60, this is millions. And 80 million Hindus, 60 million Christians, there we got it right, 120 million Africans, for a total of 270 people killed in jihad. Now the bulk of it comes to Africa because of the slave trade. something people don't know about the slave trade is we're told the story about men, evil white men on wooden ships who went to the coast of Africa, captured Africans and brought them back to sell here in the United States for profit.
Let's think about that for just a minute. Anybody believe a bunch of scurvy-ridden white guys sailed all the way over to Africa and chased down a bunch of black guys in the jungle? That's just a crazy thought. I mean, that's not the way it happened.
I think the people who do this don't give a lot of thought to it. They just like the fact that the white men were evil and they were there. But the Muslims, when they sailed to the coast of Africa, they dealt with a Muslim businessman, but slaves and a quarter, and they agreed how many men, how many women they wanted, and it was just another transaction like buying a car.
Right.
So it turns out that for every slave winding up on the slave block in South Carolina, about 8 to 11 were died. The reason is when you go into a village and you you either kill or kidnap the strong men and women, well, you're left behind. When they leave behind, you're just dealing with the village is now the old and the sick and the babies. Well, they're going to die. So it's a brutal thing to do the slave business. We need to add this. The slave business is still here today in Africa.
Yeah.
People aren't aware of that. I need to give some credit to the Christians on this because I can really bust their chops. And one of the things is it was Christians who eliminated the slave trade.
Right.
The British and the Americans did that. You would think that white people in America would know that, but nope, they don't know that because they got the original version of evil white men on wooden ships.
Yeah. Well, and it's funny too or not funny, but it's sad because now our leadership, our so-called leadership, acts like they know nothing about the inherent threat of the doctrine of Islam. But Jefferson knew, and the Marine fight song, the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli. Well, the shores of Tripoli, that was all about the Barbary pirates who were all Muslim. Yeah. And if you remember the correspondence between, I think it was Adams and Jefferson in reference to these, I think it was Adams or Jefferson one who went and spoke to or corresponded with one of the leaders of the Barbary pirates in reference to, why do you guys do this? And they basically explained, well, hey, that's what we do. That is our doctrine requires us to do that. Not in those exact words, but in a nutshell, that's our doctrine. That's essentially why they were capturing our guys and putting them in slavery. And those were predominantly white guys, by the way.
I'm sorry, Dave, I talked over you.
Go ahead.
There were over 1 million Europeans taken into slavery by the Muslims. But you don't hear that fact.
No.
We're talking about Hamas, and let me say that one thing we need to know about Israel in this war is that you would think the Jews being basically a tribe, if I can call them that, who emphasize scholarship, they would know all about Islam. Well, I did a tour of Israel on one of my many trips abroad. And let me tell you, the average Israeli knows no more about Islam than the average American citizen. I was stunned.
How can that be? How can you live in that part of the world and experience all that and not know?
Willful ignorance is a powerful force. Now, by the way, we met some people who knew all about what it was. We talked with one retired general who said, yes, you're right in all that you say. But he says the military doesn't want to talk about it. I was truly amazed in this.
So what can we expect to see? I guess just more of the same in the future in terms of specifically with the Hamas situation, or even eventually over here at the rate we're going since our borders are wide open.
Really? Do you realize how many Muslim jihadists must have come into this place in the United States in the past few years. The day will come when we will rue that, to use an old-fashioned word.
Yeah.
Because they're here and they can. One of the best ways to do something is surprise attack, which, by the way, Muhammad was a big believer in surprise attack. But we may be surprised the next time that happens. It'll make 9/11 look small. Now, I know I sound like a prophet of doom, but I'm just telling you I can sort of give you a lot of evidence to say that was true. I lived in Manhattan for several years. I was looking at it, I says, this island would be very easy to take down. It's got 5 tunnels and bridges. You cut those, the city dies. And if the city dies, you know what would happen to Wall Street? It would collapse. Do you know what happened to the world economic situation? It would collapse.
Wow.
This is a reasonable thing to surmise. I don't mean to be making trouble here, but this is, first off, the fact that you can cut the 5 bridges and tunnels. Or basically, you don't have to just make them so they don't work.
Yeah. Well, another thing too, look at the number of people that are coming across the border. We've had what they call OTMs, which is other than Mexicans, coming over for over 20 years. They found prayer cloths. They found other evidence of the people that were coming across the border were Islamic. They've known that for years. So I'm sure we've got millions of them in here, along with all of our other enemies from across the world. But think about our grids. Our grid in this country, it's not protected. And
No.
it's not as robust as it needs to be anyway. So, I mean, they could really wreak some havoc. And our so-called, our elected officials are just derelict in their duty all around on this issue and other issues.
One of the things I learned about being down in the legislature, legislators don't want to be in anything controversial.
Yeah.
They like to be as smooth as possible. So, well, we've been talking here for nearly an hour. And I think I'll never cover all this known about Islam, but I will say that what's happening with the war in Hamas against Israel it's based on Muhammad, it's based on the Islamic war doctrine, and the sex is simply part of the war doctrine of Islam. It's always been. So with that, let's wrap it up. Dave, do you have any more questions?
No, I just appreciate you being on. I'm going to do a closing, and if you'll stay with us for a couple minutes after that,
Sure.
We can talk offline just a little bit. But hey, I really appreciate you coming on. Great information. And once again, thank you for all you've done. You've educated a lot of people, myself included, and a lot of people in the state of Tennessee. So thank you for being with us. I want to thank everybody out there for taking the time to watch the program. Be sure to hit the like and subscribe buttons as well as the notification bell to stay informed about our upcoming shows. You can now listen to us on a podcast on Spreaker.com. You can find all the audio-only podcasts of your favorite episodes on the TNInformer.com, or do a search for the Tennessee Informer on Spreaker.com, where you can also download the Spreaker app for Android or Apple phones to listen while on the go. We're excited to announce Tennessee Informer podcasts are now available to listen to on iHeartRadio, Spotify, Amazon Music, Google Podcasts, and several other podcast platforms. There are many ways to watch and listen, so stay tuned as we grow and share the message. Also, please take a moment to check out and follow our Facebook page at Tennessee Informer. We'll be posting a lot of news and information there, as well as on our TNInformer.com site, and we're also now on Twitter at TNInformer. Please share us with your friends so they can stay up to date on what's going on. Our next guest for Tuesday, January 23rd, will be Matt Throckmorton, former executive director of the Tennessee Charter Schools Association, here to discuss the negative impacts of SEL on our children. And SEL is social emotional learning. That's it for now. Good night from Paris, Tennessee, that is.